I was 80 years old the first time I said his name out loud. I remember sitting by the window of my little house in Fremont, Nebraska. Snow drifted past the glass like whispers from the past, each flake reminding me of something I had buried long ago. My hand trembled as I held a photo I hadn't looked at in decades. And just like that, the words came out of my mouth. Vernon Blake, the man who stole my childhood, the man my mother let into our home and into my room. And for 70 years, I said nothing. But silence doesn't erase pain. It only buries it deeper until one day it claws its way to the surface. My name is Sandra Ward. I was born in 1945, right here in Fremont. My father, Harold, was a kind, quiet man who worked as a mechanic. He always smelled like motor oil and peppermint. He'd take me fishing on Sunday mornings and tuck me in at night with a kiss on my forehead. I used to think the world was as safe as his arms. He died when I was 8. A heart attack, they said. One moment he was joking with me at the kitchen table, and the next he was gone, slumped forward with a coffee cup still in his hand. I didn't understand then that life could change in a single breath, but I learned quickly. My mother, Margaret, fell apart after Daddy died. She stopped brushing her hair. She stopped smiling. For months, she sat on the couch and stared at the wall while I made myself peanut butter sandwiches and tried not to cry too loud. Then Vernon came. He was a post office clerk, tall, thin, with pressed shirts and shoes that always clicked on the floor. He helped Mama carry groceries once, and 2 months later, he was living in our house. Mama said he made her laugh again. She said he was going to be the man of the house. I remember the first time he looked at me in that way. I was wearing my favorite dress blue with little daisies. I'd grown taller that summer, and it fit tighter than before. Vernon smiled too long. His eyes slid over me like oil. "You're growing into a fine young lady," he said, his voice slow, like syrup. "Your daddy would be proud." But the way he said it made my stomach twist. I went to Mama and told her I didn't like the way Vernon looked at me. She frowned, then rolled her eyes. "Don't be dramatic, Sandra. He's just trying to be friendly. Be nice to him. He's trying his best." So I stayed quiet. I stayed nice. For a while, things were calm on the surface. Vernon brought me books. He rubbed my shoulders when I had a headache. He told Mama I was smart, polite, and mature for my age. But I knew better. It was in the way his hand would rest too long on my back, the way his eyes would flick to my chest when he thought I wasn't looking. I started avoiding him eating dinner faster, locking my bedroom door. One night, I forgot to lock it. I was 10. I remember every sound. The door creaked open, heavy steps across the wood floor. The smell of his aftershave sharp and sour. I pulled the blanket over my head and pretended to sleep. That didn't stop him. When I screamed, he told me to hush, that it was normal, that a smart girl like me should understand. I ran to Mama's room afterward, sobbing, my nightgown torn, my lip bleeding where I'd bitten it, trying not to scream. She sat up, bleary-eyed, and asked, "What happened?" I told her. "Everything." She looked at me for a long moment, not with shock or fear or motherly concern. No. Her face twisted into something harder. "Don't make up stories. Sandra," she whispered, "do you want to ruin everything?" Then she turned her face to the wall and went back to sleep. That was the night I learned I was alone. After that night, something inside me shut down. I wasn't a child anymore. I was just surviving. Every morning, I woke up praying it had all been a bad dream. But Vernon was still there, sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee from my father's old mug like he owned it, like he owned everything. And Mama, she went on as if nothing had happened. She'd hum while folding laundry. She'd ask me to fetch sugar from the pantry. Sometimes she'd even smile, like the world hadn't cracked open beneath our feet. That smile, cold and detached, was worse than any slap. I stopped talking, not just about what happened, but about everything. I didn't speak at school unless I had to. I didn't play hopscotch at recess or raise my hand in class. I just watched, always watched. I watched for Vernon's shadow in doorways. I watched Mama's eyes, hoping they'd soften, hoping she'd see me, but she didn't. I once overheard her on the phone with her sister, Aunt Ruth, who lived out in Lincoln. Yes. Sandra's been acting strange lately, she said. Moody, sullen. I think she's going through one of those adolescent phases. Vernon's trying to be patient. Bless him. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the phone and tell Aunt Ruth everything, but I was terrified. Vernon had warned me, if you say a word, your mother will send you away. You'll end up in one of those homes for bad girls. Do you want that? Do you want to be locked up? He always said it so calmly, like he was doing me a favor. The truth is, I believed him. I believed that nobody would believe me, because my own mother didn't. Vernon became bolder. He'd touch my shoulder in front of Mama, rub my back when we passed each other in the hallway. One time, he kissed my cheek while Mama stood in the kitchen. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask questions. She just stirred the soup. That silence, that willful blindness, was its own kind of violence. Sometimes I think it hurt worse than what Vernon did. There was one day, I must have been 12, when I came home from school and found a new doll sitting on my bed. It was porcelain, with golden curls and a pale pink dress. I stared at it for a long time. Then I took it outside and smashed it against the sidewalk until its face shattered. Vernon didn't speak to me for 2 days after that. I'd hoped it meant he was mad enough to leave me alone. But on the third night, he came into my room and made sure I understood I'd never break him the way I broke that doll. I stopped going to birthday parties. I stopped inviting anyone over. I withdrew so completely that even my teachers started to notice. One afternoon, Mrs. Landry, my English teacher, pulled me aside after class. "Sandra," she said gently, "is everything all right at home?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I saw a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the person who would save me. But Vernon's voice echoed in my head. "They'll never believe you, and if they do, your mother will hate you. She'll end up in the poorhouse." So I lied. "I'm just tired." I mumbled, "Mama's been sick, and I'm helping out more." Mrs. Landry nodded slowly, but the disappointment in her eyes stayed with me. Looking back now, I think that was the first real opportunity I had to escape, but I didn't take it. I wasn't brave enough yet. I still clung to the impossible hope that Mama would wake up and say, "I'm sorry. I should have protected you." That day never came. The longer Vernon stayed, the more invisible I became. I turned 13, then 14. My body changed, and so did his interest. He became more possessive, more aggressive. He'd say things like, "You're mine. You know that, right? Your mother doesn't appreciate you like I do." Some nights, I would stare at the ceiling and imagine myself somewhere else, anywhere but that house. I'd dream of running away, of boarding a bus to some far-off town where nobody knew my name, where I could start over. But every time I packed a small bag and stepped out onto the porch, Fear would grip my chest. Where would I go? Who would take me in? What if Vernon came looking? So I stayed. That's the cruelest part of it, how they trap you with fear and silence. How they convince you that the abuse is your fault, that you deserve it. But deep inside, a fire was starting to flicker. I didn't know it yet, but one day soon, that fire would burn bright enough to push me out the door for good. It happened when I was 15. By then, my body had grown into something I hated. I tried to hide it under loose sweaters and oversized coats. But Vernon noticed. Oh, he noticed. His touches became rougher, his whispers darker. I began to feel like a thing, an object kept behind closed doors, to be used and discarded. And worst of all, Mama never asked why I winced when I sat, or why I jumped when someone touched my arm. She just went about her day like everything was normal, like I didn't exist beyond chores and quiet obedience. But one night, something in me snapped. I had just finished washing the dinner dishes. Mama was knitting in the living room while Vernon watched the news with his feet propped on Daddy's old recliner. I walked past him, head down, trying to slip by unnoticed. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, grabbing my wrist. "To bed," I said, not meeting his eyes. He stood. Not yet. He started pulling me toward the hallway. That awful hallway. I'd walked it so many times, always in fear, always frozen. But this time, I stopped walking. "Let me go," I said. He laughed. "What did you say?" I said. "Let me go." Something wild moved through me, like all the pain, the shame, the buried rage of years had finally boiled over. I yanked my arm back, hard, and for the first time, I shoved him. He stumbled, just slightly, but it was enough. "Don't you ever touch me again," I shouted. I stood tall, shoulders back, eyes blazing. I don't think I'd ever looked him in the face like that before. I was trembling, but I didn't step away. Vernon stared at me, his eyes narrowing. He raised his hand open palm, ready to strike. But before he could hit me, Mama's voice rang out from behind us. "Vernon, what are you doing?" I turned, hopeful for one naive second that maybe, just maybe, she would finally defend me, that she had seen enough, that she would rise from that chair and become a mother again. But her expression wasn't one of concern. It was anger. At me. "What did you say to him?" "Sandra," she hissed. "Why are you shouting like that?" He tried to pull me down the hallway again," I said, voice cracking. "He's been hurting me. Mama, for years. Don't pretend you don't know." She stood slowly, walked toward us with that distant look she always wore. Then she slapped me. The sound echoed through the house. My cheeks stung, my legs buckled. "You ungrateful little girl," she spat. "After everything he's done for us. After all the trouble you've caused, and now you're making up disgusting stories like this." I looked at her then not as a child begging for love, but as a wounded soul seeing the truth for the first time. She would never choose me, not over him. Vernon smirked. "You see what happens when you spoil a girl too much?" I ran. I didn't grab a bag this time. I didn't pack clothes or food. I just ran, down the block, past the gas station, through the alleys behind Main Street. My lungs burned, and the cold wind sliced through my sweater. But I didn't stop. Not until I reached the public library. It was late, and the building was closed, but the lights were still on in the back. I banged on the door until my knuckles went red. I was crying so hard I could barely see. Finally, a shape moved through the glass. The door opened, and there she was, Mrs. Evelyn Carter. She'd been working there as long as I could remember. She had soft gray hair pinned into a bun, and always wore long cardigans that smelled like lemon soap and books. I used to spend hours there after school, mostly to avoid going home. She'd recommend mystery novels and sneak me peppermint drops when no one was looking. That night, she looked at me and didn't ask any questions. She pulled me inside, wrapped me in her coat, sat me down on the staff sofa, and gave me tea with honey. Then she said, "You don't have to talk right now, Sandra, but when you're ready, I'll listen." And I cried. I cried like I hadn't since my daddy died, like my body was trying to release years of sorrow in a single night. The next day, Mrs. Carter took me to the local police station. I was terrified. What if they didn't believe me? What if they sent me back home? But Mrs. Carter stood beside me the whole time. Her presence gave me the strength I didn't know I had. I told the officers everything about Vernon, about Mama, about the nights and the bruises and the silence. I showed them the fresh mark on my face and the older scars I had kept hidden for years. They believed me, at least enough to act. A caseworker was assigned. I was taken to a temporary foster home that night, a place with a warm bed and quiet hallways. When the officers went to our house, Mama refused to cooperate. She said I was lying, said I was troubled, said I was confused about womanhood. Vernon denied it all, of course, said I had behavioral problems and was acting out, but they didn't let him near me again. That was enough for now. I wasn't free yet, not truly. The scars were still inside me, buried deep, but for the first time, I was no longer trapped under the same roof as the man who'd stolen my innocence or the woman who had given him permission. And for the first time in years, I slept through the night. The morning sun in that new house felt unfamiliar, soft, quiet, and strangely kind. I hadn't realized how long I'd lived in shadows until I opened my eyes and felt, for the first time in years, a sense of stillness. Not safety yet. No, I wasn't ready to believe in that, but something close. Like the air wasn't heavy anymore. The foster home was run by a woman named Helen Patterson, a widow in her late 50s with strong hands and tired eyes. She wasn't overly warm, but she was consistent. She gave me my own room, a schedule, and a space to breathe. She didn't ask about my past right away, and I didn't offer. What she did do was leave a plate for me at every meal, even when I didn't come to the table. She laid out clean clothes for school, and each morning she said the same words up and at it. "Sandra, you've got a life to live." It took me weeks before I sat with her at breakfast, months before I made eye contact. But each time I showed up, she didn't make a big deal out of it. She just passed the butter, poured the milk, and carried on. That quiet, ordinary kindness, it started to stitch me back together. The caseworker assigned to me was named Julie Rayburn. She looked young and nervous, but she listened when I talked, really listened. Sometimes I'd sit across from her in that stiff office chair, and she'd ask things like, "What do you want next, Sandra?" At first, I didn't know how to answer. I'd never been asked what I wanted. My life had always been something that happened to me. But slowly, in that gray-walled room, with Julie scribbling notes and nodding patiently, I began to imagine the possibility of choice. I wanted to stay at Helen's longer. I wanted to finish school. I wanted to feel normal. Julie made it happen, piece by piece. But healing wasn't simple. There were nights I woke up sweating, convinced Vernon was in the room. Sometimes I'd scream without knowing why, or flinch when Helen accidentally touched my shoulder. I hated how broken I felt. There was one afternoon, I think it was in late fall, when I came home from school and found a man fixing Helen's back fence. He looked up and waved politely, but something about the angle of his face or the way he held the hammer made my chest tighten. I couldn't breathe. I dropped my backpack and bolted into the woods behind the house. I ran until I collapsed in the leaves, sobbing and shaking. It didn't make sense. The man hadn't done anything, but trauma doesn't care about logic. It responds to memory, to danger burned into the bones. Helen found me 2 hours later, curled up beneath a maple tree. She sat down beside me and said nothing. Not what's wrong, not come on now, not you're safe here, just silence. And somehow, that silence, so different from my mother's silence, was exactly what I needed. After a while, I whispered, I thought I was past this. Helen didn't look away. You don't get past pain, Sandra. You walk through it, sometimes barefoot, sometimes on fire, but you keep walking. That winter, I started journaling. Julie suggested it during one of our meetings, and at first, I resisted. Writing felt too risky, too raw. But one night, I took an old notebook Helen had left on the bookshelf and wrote a single sentence. He stole my voice. The next night, Mama let him, and then more. Pages and pages. I didn't read what I wrote. I didn't edit or second guess. I just poured everything out, every memory, every feeling I'd buried. Sometimes I wrote until my hand cramped or the ink ran dry. Sometimes I cried so hard I soaked the paper. But with each word, I felt a sliver of power return to me. In the spring, Julie told me something that changed everything. I think you'd benefit from meeting someone, she said. I bristled, like a therapist. She smiled. Not exactly. Her name's Miss Janice, and she runs a group for girls like you girls who've survived things. She's a survivor, too. I didn't answer right away. The idea of sitting in a room full of strangers and telling my story made me want to crawl out of my skin. But something about Julie's voice, gentle, hopeful, nudged me. So, I went. The meeting was in the basement of a church on 6th Street. The room smelled like coffee and old hymnals. Folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and a woman with silver curls and bright red glasses sat at the front. She stood when I entered. You must be Sandra, she said, her voice rich and warm. I'm Janice, and you're safe here. Those words, you're safe here, they cracked something open inside me. The other girls were older, younger, in between. Some looked polished, some raw. All of them carried stories like mine. Some spoke easily. Others sat in silence. There was no pressure, no judgment, just space. When it was my turn, I didn't know what to say. I opened my mouth and cried instead. Janice nodded. That's okay. Crying is talking. I kept going. Week after week, I showed up. I listened. I shared little pieces of my truth. And I realized I wasn't alone. I never had been. I'd just been made to believe I was. Janice once said, the world teaches us to be ashamed of surviving. But I say shame belongs to the one who caused the harm, not the one who lived through it. I carried that with me like a lantern in the dark. One day, about 6 months after I'd arrived at Helen's, she handed me a letter. I didn't recognize the handwriting. The return address was the Fremont County Correctional Facility. It was from Vernon. I stared at it for a long time. My hands trembled. Helen asked, do you want to read it? I shook my head. Then I threw it into the fireplace. I don't need his words. I said, I'm writing my own now. By the time I turned 16, I had been living with Helen Patterson for nearly a year. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged somewhere, not because I was useful, not because someone needed me to be quiet or obedient, but because I was simply allowed to exist. Helen didn't hover or pry. She wasn't a warm hug and cookies kind of woman, but her care was stitched into every little routine: folded towels, stocked pantry shelves, a steady ride to school no matter the weather. There was strength in that stability, quiet love in her consistency. She gave me space, and then slowly, she gave me responsibility. One weekend, she asked if I wanted to help her reorganize the kitchen pantry. It seemed so small at first, moving cans, wiping shelves, but something shifted in me that day. We worked side by side in silence for hours, and when we were done, she looked over at me and said, "Feels good to create order, doesn't it?" I nodded, more moved than I expected, because yes, it did feel good. At school, I started raising my hand again. It didn't come all at once, but one day in English class, Mr. Callahan asked a question about To Kill a Mockingbird, and before I could stop myself, my hand was in the air. I gave my answer something about truth and silence, and when I looked around the room, no one laughed or stared. They just listened. Later, Mr. Callahan handed me a note with my returned quiz. At the bottom, he'd written, "You have a powerful mind. Sandra, let people hear it." I carried that note in my wallet for the next 40 years. Miss Janice's support group remained my anchor. By spring, I had gone from crying silently in the back of the room to speaking whole truths aloud. I used to think I was broken beyond repair. I told them one evening, voice shaking, but now I realize I was never broken. I was hurt, and there's a difference. There was a pause. Then one of the other girls, Lisa, a 17-year-old who had survived years of abuse by her brother, stood and hugged me. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. We were rebuilding each other. That summer, Miss Janice pulled me aside after a group session. "Sandra," she said, "I think you have something special." I laughed nervously. "Like what trauma?" She smiled. "Yes, but also resilience and the gift of expression. I've watched you blossom, and I wonder, have you ever considered becoming a mentor for younger girls?" The idea stunned me a mentor. I'd spent most of my life believing I was invisible, that I was nothing but a thing to be used and discarded. But now, someone believed in me. I told her I'd think about it. In the meantime, I got a part-time job at a local diner. It was called Ruby's Place, and I started as a dishwasher. But within weeks, the manager, an older woman named Teresa, noticed I was organized, fast, and good with people. "You're wasted back there," she said one afternoon. "How'd you like to try working the counter?" I panicked. "I don't know how to talk to strangers." Teresa grinned. "Honey, just be yourself. People are a lot less scary when you realize most of them are just looking for kindness." So I tried, and little by little, I began to enjoy it. I learned how to smile at customers without shrinking inside. I learned to handle rude remarks without shaking. I even learned how to pour the perfect cup of black coffee. One regular and elderly man named Cliff once told me, "You've got a calming presence. Young lady, makes a man forget his aches." It made me want to cry, because all my life, I'd been told I was too much, too quiet, too strange, and now someone saw value in me, not for what I'd survived, but for who I was. That fall, I returned to Miss Janice and told her yes, I'd love to be a mentor. She paired me with a girl named Delilah, just 13, quiet and cautious. It was like looking at a mirror of myself from 5 years earlier. We didn't talk much at first. We just colored. Sometimes she'd ask me about high school. Sometimes I'd read her poems from the journal I had started keeping again. "One day," she whispered, "did someone hurt you too?" I looked at her, and with no shame, no fear, I said, "Yes, but I got out, and I healed. You will too." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was helping others do the same. The legal case against Vernon didn't go anywhere. My mother refused to testify, and without corroboration, the charges were dropped. I wish I could say I was surprised, but I wasn't. And somehow, I didn't need justice from the courts anymore. My justice was in every breath I took outside of that house. It was in every night I slept without fear, in every girl I helped find her voice, and in every day I chose myself. On my 17th birthday, Helen handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet. The charm read, "Speak, heal, rise." I held it to my chest and cried, for the girl I once was, and for the woman I was becoming. I was 19 when the second letter came. I had just finished my morning shift at Ruby's place, wiping down the last table near the window, when Teresa walked in from the back office, envelope in hand. "Sandra," she said, holding it out, "this came for you." My stomach twisted the moment I saw the handwriting. It was the same sharp, angular scrawl I remembered from bills and old grocery lists taped to our fridge. The same penmanship that had signed my permission slips and written birthday cards that meant nothing. Vernon Blake. I didn't open it, not right away. Instead, I shoved it into the bottom of my purse and carried it home like a ticking bomb. I sat at the edge of my bed for hours, staring at that envelope like it might crawl out and speak. Helen found me there. She looked at the letter, then at me. "Do you want me to take it?" she asked. "No," I said. "I need to know." So I opened it. It wasn't long, maybe 4 paragraphs. He wrote from prison in Omaha, where he'd landed after an unrelated assault. He said he'd found God, that he was sorry for any pain he might have caused me. He never admitted what he did, just danced around it in careful language, making himself sound like a man seeking peace. The last line read, "I hope one day you can forgive me. Your mother already has." I folded the letter carefully, walked to the fireplace, and threw it into the flames. I watched the paper curl and blacken. I waited until the ink disappeared, until his words meant nothing. Forgiveness is a strange thing. People talk about it like it's the end goal of healing, but I don't think that's true. Not always. Some wounds don't need to be forgiven. They need to be released. Burning that letter wasn't about Vernon. It was about me. I was choosing to stop carrying his shame, to stop letting his voice echo in my mind. I wasn't letting him off the hook. I was unhooking myself. That fall, I moved into a small studio apartment above a bakery. It wasn't much, just a twin bed, a secondhand dresser, and a hot plate, but it was mine. I took on more hours at Ruby's and started attending community college in the evenings. I focused on writing and psychology, drawn to both the stories people carried and the silent ways trauma shaped them. Miss Janice continued to mentor me as I mentored others. Delilah, the young girl I'd been paired with, was thriving. She'd started writing poetry and even read one at a group meeting. When she looked over at me afterward, her eyes shone with pride. "You helped me find my words," she said. I smiled. "You already had them. You just needed someone to hear them." One evening, after class, I returned home to find Helen sitting on my front step. She was holding a small manila folder. "I wanted to give you something," she said. Inside the folder were photocopies, court records, old police reports, notes from the caseworker assigned to me years earlier. At the very back was a handwritten note from Julie Rayburn, my first caseworker. It read, "Sandra Ward is one of the strongest young women I've ever worked with. She will not only survive, she will rise." I didn't even know she'd written that. Helen stood to leave, but before she did, she said, "Your story matters. It always has." I cried again that night, not because I was broken, but because I had survived. Around that same time, I received another letter. This one was from Rebecca, my half-sister. I hadn't heard from her since I left home. She was 11 the last time I saw her, too young to understand what had been happening, too sheltered by Mama to know the truth. But now she was 23, with a child of her own, and she had found my name through a local support network. In her letter, she wrote Mama passed last month. "I'm not writing to reopen wounds, but I found your name in some old files. I don't know what happened back then, but I always wondered why you left. I'd like to understand if you're willing, for days." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to shut the door forever. But another part, the one that had learned to speak, to listen, to heal, knew this wasn't just about the past. It was about ending the cycle. So I wrote back. We met a month later at a diner off Highway 275. Rebecca looked just like Mama, same dark hair, same high cheekbones, but her eyes were softer. She hugged me. I let her, over coffee and nervous laughter. I told her the truth, all of it. She cried, not just for me, but for herself, for being kept in the dark, for never knowing the kind of pain that had shaped her sister's silence. "I wish Mama had protected you," she whispered. "I wish she had too," I said, "but I'm not waiting on her anymore." That night, I sat in my apartment and opened my journal. I wrote, "He tried to steal my voice. Mama tried to erase it, but I wrote it back. I burned the shame, and I am still here." And that was everything. The day I stood in front of a room full of teenage girls and shared my story for the first time. My voice shook so hard, I thought I might faint. It wasn't at a formal event or fancy auditorium. It was just a folding table in the back of a community youth center in Fremont, Nebraska. A handful of girls sat scattered across plastic chairs, arms crossed, eyes guarded. I understood that look, the armor they wore. I cleared my throat and started simple. "My name is Sandra. When I was your age, I was hurt by someone in my own home, and no one helped me, not even my mother." A few of them blinked. One looked away. I spent years thinking it was my fault, that I was ruined. But I was wrong. What happened to me wasn't love. It wasn't normal. It wasn't my shame to carry. Silence. And then one small voice from the back. My uncle touched me too. Her voice cracked on the last word. The room froze. I looked at her not with pity, but with recognition. "You're not alone," I said. "You never were." And in that moment, something powerful shifted. I wasn't just telling my story anymore. I was giving permission. Permission to speak, to feel, to fight back, to rise. That girl's name was Mariah, and she would become the first of many girls I mentored personally. She was only 14, but her eyes held the same storm I'd once carried. Over the next year, I helped her navigate the child welfare system, guided her through court appearances, and held her hand through nights of tears and panic attacks. She went on to finish high school, enroll in college, And years later, she joined me as a youth counselor. "I'm here because of you," she said once during a presentation, but she's here because she refused to disappear. After that first talk, word began to spread. Miss Janice invited me to lead a monthly workshop for survivors. Then a school counselor asked if I'd speak during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Then a nonprofit in Lincoln asked if I'd consult on youth trauma recovery programs. I wasn't a licensed therapist. I didn't have a PhD, but I had something else live truth, and that mattered. I turned my tiny studio apartment into a planning space. I wrote curriculum guides at the kitchen table, printed flyers at the library, and hosted the first Silent No More peer support group in the basement of a Lutheran church. Within 6 months, the group outgrew the room. Within 2 years, I applied for nonprofit status. And within 5, the Ward Center for Youth Empowerment opened its doors in downtown Fremont. We started with 3 staff members and a mission: to give girls and young women the tools, space, and courage to reclaim their lives. We offered trauma-informed counseling, emergency shelter referrals, mentorship programs, legal advocacy, and creative arts workshops. Every wall in that center had color, warmth, and poetry written by survivors. Every girl who entered was greeted not with forms, but with food, warmth, and someone who looked them in the eye and said, "You are safe here." I hung that phrase above the main door in large wooden letters. It was the first thing I wished someone had said to me. In 1987, I was honored by the state of Nebraska for my work with at-risk youth. The award ceremony was in a courthouse, a place that had once ignored my cries. As I stood at the podium, looking out over an audience of judges, social workers, teachers, and fellow survivors, I read a letter aloud. It wasn't one of Vernon's letters. It was the note written by my first caseworker, Julie Rayburn, the one Helen had given me years earlier. Sandra Ward is one of the strongest young women I've ever worked with. She will not only survive, she will rise. I looked out at the crowd. She was right, I said. And every girl you see in these seats today, they're rising too. Applause roared through the room. Not for me alone, but for every girl who dared to speak up. For every woman who came back for another girl. For every voice once silenced that now sang out in defiance. Miss Janice passed away in the early 90s. I held her hand in hospice. Her last words to me were, "Keep them speaking. Sandra, that's how we win." I carry those words with me every day. I never remarried. I never had children of my own. But through the Ward Center, I've mothered hundreds of girls who once thought they were worthless, who now write books, lead groups, hold babies of their own, and stand before microphones telling their truths. I still visit the library where I ran for safety all those years ago. It's changed, of course. New floors, brighter lights. But there's a small plaque near the entrance now that reads, "Dedicated to the courage of Sandra Ward, who turned silence into sanctuary." I didn't want the recognition, but I accepted it for every girl who never got a plaque, for every child who suffered quietly in the dark, hoping someone might listen. When people ask me if I ever forgave Vernon, I tell them this: I forgave myself for staying quiet, for believing I was the problem, for carrying guilt that wasn't mine. That's what healing really is, learning to love the parts of yourself someone else tried to destroy. And when they ask if I forgave my mother, I say I don't carry her choices anymore. They don't belong to me. I'm 80 years old now, and some nights the past still visits, but it doesn't break me because I broke free. And every time a girl walks into our center, sits down with her hands clenched in her lap and says, "I need help. I see myself in her." And I smile not because the pain is gone, but because I know she won't face it alone. It was early autumn when the letter arrived. I was sipping coffee on the porch of the ward center, the air crisp, the trees along Main Street just beginning to turn. The center's mailbox was usually filled with grant notices or program brochures, but this envelope was different, thicker, handwritten, no return address. I almost didn't open it. After all these years, I'd learned not everything that came uninvited deserved my attention, but something nudged me, a quiet pull in my chest. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper and a small black and white photograph, faded, creased down the middle. It was a picture of me as a girl, maybe 9 or 10, standing in front of our old house on Lincoln Avenue. My arms were crossed tight across my chest. My eyes haunted, even then, and the letter, written in familiar cursive, read, "Sandra, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I asked Rebecca to send this after I passed. I don't deserve your time, but I wanted to leave you with the truth I was too much a coward to say while I was alive. I knew what Vernon was doing. I knew the first night you came to me shaking, with tears in your eyes. I chose silence because I was afraid of losing him. I thought I needed him more than I needed to protect you. I was wrong. There is no forgiveness I expect, but there is shame I carried until my last breath. I hope, somehow, you found peace. Mama, I sat motionless for a long time, not angry, not sad, just quiet. Because the words I had begged to hear as a child had finally come, but not from lips I could look into, and not at a time when they could change anything. Still, it mattered, not for reconciliation, but for recognition. Later that evening, I lit a candle and sat by the fireplace in my office. I held the photo in my hand, tracing the younger version of myself with my thumb. "I forgive you." I whispered not to my mother, but to the little girl in the picture, for blaming herself, for staying silent, for carrying burdens no child ever should. Then I placed the photograph in the fire. It curled at the edges, caught flame, and vanished into ash. And with it, I let go of the last piece of the past that tried to own me. A few days later, I called a meeting with the Ward Center's Board of Directors. I've been thinking, I began, about the future. A hush fell over the room. I'm not leaving just yet. I smiled. But I want to prepare for when I do. This place was never meant to end with me. They nodded, some teary-eyed, all respectful. I had already begun mentoring a young woman named Chelsea Monroe, a former program participant turned counselor. She was brilliant, fierce, and kind in a way that wrapped around people like a blanket. She reminded me of myself, only stronger, braver, much earlier. I want her to carry the torch. I said. The vote was unanimous. Passing the torch wasn't an ending. It was a continuation, a promise. Chelsea brought new energy, new ideas, new hope under her. We opened a mobile counseling unit for rural counties and partnered with schools across Nebraska. But every time she spoke at a fundraiser or met a scared girl for the first time, she'd say, "I was helped by a woman named Sandra Ward, and because she healed, I could too." Now, I spend most of my days gardening behind the center or writing in my journal beneath the old elm tree we planted for Miss Janice. Sometimes, the younger staff ask me to speak to a new group of girls, and when I walk into that circle, I always begin the same way. My name is Sandra Ward, and once I thought my story would end in silence, but now I know it was only just beginning. I never thought I'd live to be 80. There were many nights, far too many, when I didn't think I'd survive the next morning. Nights when I curled up under thin sheets with fear pressing down on my chest, praying for someone, anyone to save me. Now, all these decades later, I sit on my porch in Fremont, Nebraska, wrapped in a handmade quilt from the girls at the Ward Center, and I watch the sun set over the same streets I once ran down barefoot, desperate to escape. Funny how the very place that broke you can, in time, also be where you find your healing. The house I live in now is small but warm. It was once the caretaker's home behind the original Ward Center building. When Chelsea expanded the organization, she offered it to me as a permanent residence. "I want you to be near the place you built," she said. "This is yours." I smiled and told her, "It's all yours now. I'm just visiting what I made room for. And it's true, I don't run things anymore. I don't lead workshops or write grant proposals, but I still walk through those doors once a week, greet the girls, restock books in the reading room, and sit quietly in the garden with whoever needs company. Sometimes just being present is enough. One afternoon, a teenage girl named Lacey sat beside me under the elm tree. She had just entered the program after escaping a home, much like the one I once knew, full of silence, denial, and pain. She didn't say a word for nearly 10 minutes. Then, almost too softly to hear, she asked, "Do you still think about it? What happened to you?" I looked at her gently. "Yes," I said, "but it doesn't hurt the same way anymore." She frowned. "How does it stop hurting?" I thought for a moment, then replied, "When you start building things out of it, when your life becomes bigger than the pain." She nodded slowly. Her hand found mine. Rebecca visits now, with her grandchildren in tow. We've come a long way through confusion, distance, grief, and finally, forgiveness. She once asked me how I could still love her after everything, and I told her, "Because none of this was your fault. You were a child, too." We both were. She brings me pie from the bakery near her home in Omaha, and we sit on the porch swapping stories. Her youngest, Millie, likes to braid my thinning white hair and say, "You look like a storybook grandma." Sometimes, I think, maybe I've become one. I keep a box in my bedroom closet, a wooden chest with brass hinges, worn smooth by time. Inside are pieces of my journey. The bracelet Helen gave me with the words, "Speak, heal, rise." A letter from Mariah, now a social worker in Des Moines. A copy of the very first flyer from the Silent No More group. And at the very bottom, my old journal, the one with the first sentence I ever wrote in my own voice. He stole my voice. It still takes my breath away to read that line. Not because it brings the pain back, but because I now know how far I've come from it. I've written hundreds of pages since then, and not one of them belongs to him. Sometimes I wonder what little Sandra, the frightened, silenced girl I once was, would say if she saw me now. Would she believe this life, this peace, this joy? I hope so. I hope she'd see that her pain wasn't the end, that her survival became someone else's lifeline, that her story lit candles in the darkness for those still searching for the exit. I hope she'd see that she came home, not to a place, but to herself. I've lived a long life, 80 years filled with shadows and light, grief and grace, a life I once thought would never be mine to own. And now, in these quiet days, when the sun hits my porch just right and the laughter of children from the Ward Center drifts in through my window, I know one thing with all my heart: I made it. not just out of that house or out of that pain, but into something far greater than survival. I made it into healing, into purpose, into freedom. People often ask me how I did it, how I endured what I did, and still managed to love, to trust, to live without hate consuming me. And my answer is always the same, because I chose not to let what happened to me be the only story I carried. Yes, I was a victim. Yes, I was betrayed. Yes, my voice was stolen from me for years. But I got it back, and when I did, I used it not just for myself, but for others. Because healing isn't just about leaving the past behind. It's about turning around, reaching back, and saying to the next frightened soul, "Come with me. There's a way out. You don't have to stay there." If you're listening to this, maybe you've been through something. Maybe you know someone who has. Or maybe you're wondering if your story still matters. Let me tell you it does, even if your voice shakes. Even if your heart still aches, even if you feel like you're too old, too broken, or too late you're not. It's never too late to speak. It's never too late to heal. It's never too late to become the person you were meant to be before the pain tried to rewrite you. My name is Sandra Ward. I was once a forgotten child in a quiet Nebraska town. Today, I am a woman who helped build a sanctuary for voices like mine. And when I'm gone, the voices will continue. Because pain may echo, but so does courage. And I've learned that even the faintest whisper of truth can become a roar that changes the world. No one chooses how their story begins, but we do get to choose how it ends. You can live in silence, or you can speak, and in doing so, light the path for someone else. You are not what happened to you. You are what you do next. If this story touched your heart, even in the smallest way, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. You never know who might find hope in your words. And if you want to hear more stories like mine of truth, survival, and strength, please subscribe to this channel. Every voice matters. Every story deserves to be heard, because somewhere out there, someone is waiting to know they're not alone. Let's make sure they hear us.